Hi, this is Lucia Inman. In today's video, I would like to talk about some signs that are characteristic of vulnerable narcissism and just go over the definition and the differences between grandiose narcissism and vulnerable narcissism. Vulnerable narcissism is a construct and it's not considered to be a personality disorder, so it's not in the DSM-5 at this time. In the DSM-5 right now we have narcissistic personality disorder, but that represents grandiose narcissism the best, while vulnerable narcissism is actually closely associated with borderline personality disorder, if you want to think of it in terms of personality disorders. But vulnerable narcissism would be more of a subclinical diagnosis. Both types, grandiose and vulnerable narcissism, are on a continuum, so they develop when the person is really little, when they're a child, and they continue on a pervasive manner through the lifespan. I would like to briefly talk about some of the commonalities that we see between borderline personality disorder and vulnerable narcissism. Some of these shared features are identity disturbance, a need for admiration, mood dysregulation, being insecure, having low self-esteem, and being jealous and possessive. Both are also characterized by having a fear of not being loved or accepted. So with vulnerable narcissism, we also see a lot of rage, a lot of anger. This is a shared trait with borderline personality, but the difference is that somebody with borderline personality will express their anger through violence, while the vulnerable narcissist will typically express their anger through passive aggression, but there is a lot of it. So when most people think of narcissism, they always think of the grandiose type, because this is the type that it's obvious and that we see a lot represented on TV and other places. But a vulnerable narcissist is just as toxic, if not more, than a grandiose narcissist. And they can be extremely dangerous because they're so difficult to spot unless you know exactly what you're looking for. So because of these, they actually cause a lot of damage, and because their form of abuse is so subtle, the person that's being abused by them can't really go out and tell people what they're doing, because at first sight it doesn't seem like such a big deal, but over time it's a very serious form of abuse that they engage in. The next thing I would like to do is comparing grandiose narcissism with vulnerable narcissism, because they share a list of common traits, but they also have a lot of differences. So some of the things they share is they both have a negative correlation with agreeableness. So what that means is the higher the level of narcissism, the lower the level of agreeableness in the person. They both share a need for admiration and attention, and this happens on a regular daily basis. They also have low trust, they have low cooperation, low altruism, jealousy, and a sense of entitlement. When it comes to the differences, there's actually quite a few of them. The first one that stands out to me is that with grandiose narcissism, we see a higher level of extraversion, while with vulnerable narcissism, the extraversion is pretty low. So these people are also very socially awkward. Now that doesn't mean that every person that's socially awkward is a vulnerable narcissist, but when a person is a vulnerable narcissist, it's very likely that they will be socially awkward. The social awkwardness that they have doesn't just stop there. They actually come off as uninterested, disengaged. Sometimes a vulnerable narcissist can pass as a good listener, but because they have such low levels of empathy, what will happen is that when a person is talking to them, they will be in their own world and just pretending to be listening. even though they're really not interested in what that person has to tell them, but they will want to appear as a highly empathetic person. They want to look good in front of people, so they'll pretend like they're listening. Another thing that you will notice in social situations is that sometimes a vulnerable narcissist will like stay in the background and won't really engage with people. And when you have a conversation with them, a lot of times it's very subtle, but you will see that they will redirect the conversation back to them. Actually, both grandiose and vulnerable narcissists do this, but I feel like because vulnerable narcissism is such a covert form of narcissism, they do all of these things in a very subtle way. A major difference between these two types of narcissism is that people of the grandiose type usually have pretty low neuroticism, and on the other hand, somebody who's a vulnerable narcissist is going to be very, very high in neuroticism. Neuroticism is one of the 5-factor model traits. So those traits are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So this trait of neuroticism has 6 facets. Those facets are anxiety, anger or hostility, depression, self-consciousness, impulsiveness, and vulnerability. They also suffer from anxiety, including social anxiety. They also suffer from depression, and this is a pervasive pattern through their lifespan. They tend to have a negative view of things. They're the ultimate victim. They're very self-conscious. Another difference is that a grandiose narcissist is going to be a lot more assertive and a lot more blunt, while a vulnerable narcissist isn't going to be as assertive as the grandiose type, and they won't always share their true opinion of things. Something that's different from grandiose narcissism is that vulnerable narcissists experience a lot of pain, and it's through this suffering that they experience everything about life. But in the long run, this can be very, very toxic, because for somebody who is in a marriage, in a close friendship with them, just in a close relationship with them of any type, it's gonna impact the way they also view life and the way that other person experiences life, because the person that they love has this negative filter that they see things through. And the last difference that I have between these two types of narcissism is that a grandiose narcissist is not going to react well to criticism, but because they feel like other people aren't good enough to criticize them, so they're above everybody else in their mind. However, on the other hand, the vulnerable narcissist is going to react poorly to criticism, but for the opposite reason. Because they're so insecure, and because they're absolutely terrified of judgment and rejection, they take every single critique or feedback personally. They're very thin-skinned, and so when you offer feedback to them, instead of reacting like a mentally healthy person, they just overreact every single time, because the idea that another person doesn't think highly of them all the time, it's actually a very painful thought to them. Also, their rage is easily activated, but they're much more sophisticated in the way of hurting people. When there is a disagreement or a conflict, they'll resort to manipulation through gaslighting, through blame shifting, and through having a victim mentality. They will also resort to guilt trips. You should not expect a vulnerable narcissist to be an open and honest person, and they're very low in cooperation, so they always want to make things work, but because they blame others for everything that happens, and because they can't quite figure out what's wrong with them, they can never really successfully overcome most of these obstacles. Another interesting characteristic of vulnerable narcissism, this is actually a shared trait with psychopathy and with antisocial personality disorder, is that they don't experience a whole lot of guilt. because they have such low levels of cognitive and affective empathy as well, when they hurt somebody, make a mistake, do something terribly wrong, instead of feeling guilty, they feel a lot of shame. So because of their self-esteem is low, and because all they care about is what people think of them, they're not really going to worry too much about how other people feel, but they will worry very much about what other people think of them and what opinions people have of them. Because of this shame component that's so strong with vulnerable narcissism, you will see that when they clearly make a mistake, it's very difficult to get them to apologize. Just to say, I'm sorry, I was completely wrong. There is no excuse for me to do that. Can you forgive me? Just to say that, and to say it sincerely, that's almost an impossible task, because what they will do when they make a mistake is that they will come up with 1,000 excuses to justify their bad behavior. Another thing that they do, because they feel so much shame and this is so painful, is that they turn the blame onto other people. So if you're criticizing them for something that they have done, instead of apologizing, they will say, because of what you did, it triggered me to do this other terrible thing. So again, blame shifting is extremely common, excuses are extremely common, and huge red flags when it comes to vulnerable narcissism. And what you will see most of the time is not only that they're deflecting responsibility, but that when you're arguing with them, they will always find a way to adopt a victim mentality. In their mind, they really believe that they're the ultimate victims. When they were little, everybody mistreated them, which is probably true, but they learned how to encase themselves into that role. And so when things go wrong, in their mind, they really believe that it's always somebody else's fault. So I didn't succeed because life wasn't fair, or I cheated on you because you were not paying attention to me. Another one of the key features of vulnerable narcissism is actually passive aggression. When there is a conflict, they won't openly talk to you and say, hey, you really hurt my feelings, I wish you wouldn't have done that, or I didn't like that you did this because this and that and that and that, can we work this out somehow? No, they're not gonna do any of that, okay? Because doing that would mean that they're exposing themselves, they're exposing their emotions, and they're being vulnerable. So instead of doing that, they will resort to passive aggression. Now, there are many ways of expressing passive aggression, but I feel like one of their favorite ways to do this is through the silent treatment. So if you live with them, they won't talk to you, or they will just reply to you with like yes or no answers, just really short answers, acting really cold, really detached. If you message them, texted them, they've seen the message, but they're just not gonna reply to you, okay? For the vulnerable narcissist, when you hurt their feelings, they can only get relief if they hurt the other person even more. That's also an expression of sadism. And what they're doing is just waiting for an apology, because in their mind, they're so self-entitled that they can't possibly be wrong. It's always somebody else's fault, and they are the victim. A variant of the silent treatment is that they give you the silent treatment in addition to a smearing campaign. So then they create that tension and they put that social pressure on the actual victim to apologize, right? This is actually a very subtle form of abuse. They actually love engaging into this toxic, malignant behavior because this gives them a lot of attention. They're putting another person down, right? So they're elevating themselves. And then on top of that, they're acting like the victim that they think they are. They also constantly feel misunderstood because in their head, they're unique. and they're different and they're talented, okay? And that can be true to an extent, but that's true about a lot of people. And that's just something they don't understand. It's not just that they're unique and the whole world doesn't understand them. It's that everybody is unique. But in their mind, they're misunderstood their whole life. If they're married, they will blame the husband and they will tell the husband, you don't understand me, I'm just too complex for you, or my friends don't get me. And they really believe this. But most of the time, this belief it's not true. They're not that talented, they're not that special, and they're definitely not that unique. But they encase themselves into those identity ideals. Vulnerable narcissists also experience something called schadenfreude, and that's when they experience joy while observing other people's misfortune. Now, this is an extension of their envy, because they have such great levels of envy, and envy and jealousy are both very painful emotions. A way for them to deal with the pain of those emotions is seeing other people fail, or seeing other people struggling or going through a really rough patch, because that elevates them onto a higher position. And because their self-esteem is so poor, they need to know that they're better than other people. Schadenfreude is also a manifestation of subclinical sadism. Typically, vulnerable narcissists do experience this form of sadism. A lot of times you will see that they will also criticize people a lot, and that's another manifestation of their low self-esteem and their insecurity, because by putting other people down and telling others how horrible of a person somebody is, it puts them in the superior position, and they really need to feel that way. Another trait of vulnerable narcissism is pathological lying and dishonesty. This is seen also in Grandiose Narcissism. It's also seen in antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy. Sometimes it's seen in borderline personality and histrionic personality disorders. So usually a way in which they mask their lies is by telling half-truths. So in this situation, when the person ends up finding out the entire truth about the lie that they've been telling, they will confront them, and they will have this tendency to gaslight the person, or just having the perfect excuse for lying. With both types of narcissism, and really with any type of personality disorder, you see lower insight than with somebody that doesn't have a personality disorder. But especially with narcissism, there is particularly low insight and very low introspection. However, the level of insight that a vulnerable narcissist has is always going to be higher than that of a grandiose narcissist. So they know that there is something wrong with them, but they can never pinpoint at what it is. And you'll see that a lot of times the vulnerable narcissist will continue to try to improve and will continue to try to figure out what's wrong with them. But all those attempts, they will all fail, because vulnerable narcissism is such a pervasive pattern that the person is always gonna go back to those roots. These individuals also have an extremely hard time forgiving people. So if you did something to them 10 years ago, they're always going to remember and continue to bring it up. A way in which this manifests is that a lot of times, especially in like social settings, it's really strange, I think, because when they like meet new people, sometimes they'll have this tendency to put themselves into the victim position to gain that person's empathy through pity. So they will start telling the person they just met all the horrible things that they went through as a child or as a teenager or whatever, and how horrible people have treated them. And so usually the person is baffled that they're hearing all these stories, but it tends to be a pretty effective technique to gain the person's empathy. However, this becomes a really toxic behavior when they engage in it over and over and over again. And the worst part about it is that they don't have enough insight a lot of the times to realize that they're doing this. So if you try to point this out to them, they will be like, no, that's not what I'm doing. that's not what I'm doing. In their mind, and this happens also with grandiose narcissism, if being a narcissist just required eating a bowl of oatmeal every morning, and they did just that, they are still not a narcissist, okay? They're gonna have a million excuses. The reason why they won't even accept that is because it's such a painful thought, but also because they're very dishonest, not only with other people, but also with themselves. They also have an incredibly strong craving for validation, admiration, and attention. So they don't like when in a social setting another person is getting more attention than they are. This also happens in any relationship. They're very possessive, very jealous, but they won't express that overtly. Also, they will tend to engage in activities that they think can bring them narcissistic supply. So admiration, people telling them how well they did. Because they don't really have genuine passion for any particular activity or hobby, they will engage into lots of different things, and they will just tap the surface and then they will move on to the next thing. This is because they get bored really easily. These people also view relationships in a commercial way. So if somebody is useful to them, if they consider that that person is beneficial to their life and to their goals, they will accept you into their life and they'll engage into a relationship with you. They'll be your friend or your partner or wherever. But then once that you don't fit their goals, you will be discarded. And they don't really care so much about feelings or about deep emotions. And so that's why it makes it so easy for them to discard a person and just go with another. One last trait I wanted to mention of vulnerable narcissism, and this actually is a trait of both types of narcissism, is that they get easily bored. This is a shared trait with borderline personality, and so sometimes they'll engage into affairs or compulsive shopping and behaviors like that they keep the excitement up in their lives, but they're not necessarily healthy behaviors. Sometimes you can see that some of them can have a porn addiction. Now that doesn't mean that every person that has a porn addiction is a narcissist, but if you encounter a toxic narcissist, it's not uncommon that they will also have a porn addiction. Now you must be wondering, what causes vulnerable narcissism? Mostly it's just abuse, but also inconsistent discipline. So the child is growing up and they do this bad thing, and then one day they get punished with a little punishment or no punishment at all, and then the next day they do the exact same thing and they get heavily punished. So the child doesn't know what's going on and doesn't know what to do, and so this is one of the known causes for vulnerable narcissism, besides physical and verbal abuse. Now with grandiose narcissism, and I think this applies to both types, but also overpraising your child can cause narcissism later on. So basically, you don't want to praise your child too much, and you also don't want to abuse them. And if you do both, your child is most likely to also develop some kind of psychopathology. That said, there is also a genetic component to it, so it's not all about how you've been raised. These are my thoughts on vulnerable narcissism. I hope that you found this helpful. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!